Coming live from New York, USA is our guest tonight. Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And before I move forward, may I request you to subscribe, follow, like, and comment on whichever platform you are watching or listening to this show on. And today we have Muna Ikedionwu. She is the founder and president of M.KEDI, and it's a business strategy agency. Welcome to the show, Muna.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we'll be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in brand building and building businesses. So, Muna, it makes me curious that you focus so much on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Tell us about what exactly you do at your company. We do know it's a business strategy agency. You deal with many sort of clients, but it will be better if we can understand from you and how do you actually bring in DEI into the way you conduct your work?
I think the work that I do tends to fall between two categories that oftentimes don't overlap very well, which is traditional business strategy, which is how do you build a business, grow a business, scale a business. Then, of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion that falls a lot into social impact, social equity, employer responsibility, CSR, and things like that. I say that I'm a business strategist by trade. That's my background. That's what I went to school for. That's where I entered into my career, but always had a passion for social impact and inclusion, specifically in the clients I chose. The rise of mission-driven brands over the past 10 years, social impact projects and initiatives being baked into people's growth strategy really was where I was leaning towards. And then in my work, it became clear that there were a select number of brands that were doing it really, really right most of the time, but took one misstep. Or they understood the importance of inclusion or impact or diversity, but they didn't quite know how to implement it. And that's the kind of the group of people are saying that they're 80% of the way there. And that's usually where there's a bit more writing on doing it well. When your consumer already knows you're interested and cares, they hold you to a higher standard. So my role as the business strategist that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion is to come in and help those founders, those teams, and those executives figure out what their values are, how they want that to exist in their business and in the world, and then translate that to scalable business strategies. It's essentially taking a thoughtful, future-forward look at the human aspect of business and making sure that as you increase the good in the world, you're also increasing the sustainability of your business and the ability for you to continue making revenue and profit.
Right, Muna, right. One thing, that raises my curiosity is that you were a chemist earlier, and then you actually moved into entrepreneurship. You founded this company. So how did that? It's a great achievement, quite inspiring, and that too a good inspiration for women empowerment, if I can call it. And then on top of it, you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. How did that change happen from a former chemist to a present entrepreneur, president of a company? That's very inspiring. So it's very important for me to ask you so that our audience can know about it.
It's on the outside looking in, it seems like a really dramatic shift. For me, it always seemed to make sense. And I credit that shift or that transition specifically to the mentors in my life who saw me for what I was good at and what I was pursuing. I am very passionate and excited about STEM. I grew up really loving science. I was one of those folks who went into school believing that I was going to be a doctor, chemical engineer, doing all of that. That was going to be my life dream, passion to pursue that career path. But at the end of the day, my goal was always to start a beauty or skincare brand, specifically in a beauty or skincare brand that prioritized people with darker skin like myself or specific skin conditions that show up on darker skin in a different way. So yes, it was very STEM focused. And yes, that's the pathway I felt like I could get into that role. But the end goal was always to be an entrepreneur, always to be a founder, and specifically with this focus on reaching a broader, more diverse audience. And considering the fact that I actually was pursuing both of those pathways at the same time, but it was, and I'm not gonna say it's easier to break into STEM per se, but it's a lot easier to be impressive in that sense, right? That the door is open for you, people are really excited, people listen to what you say, versus being a Black woman in like the business sector or in some of these strategy conversations. I felt like I wasn't getting the respect I deserved, or wasn't being able to speak up in the way or bring value in the same way I could from the chemistry perspective. So that's really, I think that it was, part of it was the passion, wanting to be impressive, but also that external value and respect. And it wasn't until a mentor of mine, when I was explaining to them my future and why I was doing what I was doing, that she looked back at me and said, you don't need to get every degree in the world and be a chemist and a doctor and all of those things to gain the respect. You get the respect because you know what you're talking about and the proof is in the work. So getting that confidence, or kind of empowering me to own my truth and knowing that I deserve to be in those spaces and deserve to be in those rooms, and I'm allowed to pursue these things that maybe historically people like me haven't been in, was the push I needed to realize that yes, I can be good at science and good at, you know, chemistry, but I was really great at business, right? You can be good at something, but where do you like really, really actually make a difference? And that was just what I needed. And from there, it essentially just took off. I think that the first couple of instances was a little bit of adjustment, but like she said, confidence begets confidence. So eventually it got to a space where now a lot of my work is on the strategy business side, and a little bit overlaps the chemistry side, but not necessarily. Definitely not in like the research side of things, at least.
Right. You are indeed very good at business, and that's why you're not just running your own business, but also advising businesses. And that too on DEI. So I wanted to understand, a lot of companies, they talk about big stuff, great stuff that they are doing in their company, but actually many of them are focused on profits. So what do they come to you for? Do they come for implementing DI in their companies, or do they come for business? And how do you bring this DI stuff in that conversation? Are they very understanding of this stuff, or is it that you talk about it and those who want to implement, you talk it further with them? How does it work? Because I am still trying to understand how far this particular stuff is getting successful with so much of, not diversity, but there's so much of diversity, but at the same time with the increasing divisions in our societies globally, not just in the US.
So I would say that companies come to me for both, because specifically where I specialize in is the intersection of both of them. And I think for many of my clients, before they start working with me, they feel this push and pull. They feel that they have to either choose, like you said, choose a diversity, equity, and inclusion, or profit. They have to choose which one to focus on or prioritize. And my pitch, my specialty, what I want to make sure all of my clients know and anyone I work with is that it's not an either or. Ideally, really good diversity, equity, and inclusion should actually help your profits. And increased profits should also be able to help your diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are synergistic. So as one increases, the other increases. So it doesn't actually have to be an either or. It actually can be a strategic advantage of you to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in that area, when they come to me, it usually comes from a place of, which is reasonable, right? They're business owners, they're business founders, and they're saying, as we have a business, we have to focus on profit. We're a for-profit business, or even if they're nonprofits, I do work with nonprofits, that we still need to get donations. We still need to have people, want to give to us, but we don't want to sacrifice these values. We don't want to get canceled. We don't want people abandoning us because of the stances that we take. So how do we do both? And that's where it comes in. So it doesn't always look as big and flashy as the news makes it seem. I'm, super excited that there's all of these brands that are making these huge commitments and donating millions of dollars and, proposing that they're going to revamp their entire company. And I'm excited to see if and when that plays out in actuality in the future. But a lot of my work actually looks much more subtle and nuanced because I believe slow and steady wins the race. You cannot solve a 400-year-old problem in a 40-minute strategy meeting. So it's a lot of figuring out, how do we shift our supply chain? How do we reimagine the way we do merchandising in our stores? How do we revamp our recruitment and hiring process? If we're developing a board, right, what does that look like? If we are bringing in investors, who's on our cap table? If we're looking to exit, how are those conversations being had? How do we ensure that who is acquiring us and understands and commits to retaining our values as we move forward? Those are the kind of conversations I tend to have. And they tend to require a lot more work. Like I said, more than that 40-minute meeting than people tend to expect. It's not just believing that you're doing the right thing. It's a lot of times putting the right levers and systems in play so that that it does follow through, right? Whether it's in a contract, whether it's, right, like who you're sourcing from, all of these different elements that build the puzzle together of a truly diverse and inclusive and equitable workplace for employees and for customers and for founders.
Right, right. So, which companies from which sector do generally approach you for consultation to take your advice?
So I work primarily in fashion, beauty, and wellness, and that's an area that I particularly have interest in. Like I said, I want to start a beauty company, so it's where my mind went first. I also think, especially if we consider that June 2020 was a major year or major time for people to shift the way that they think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. After George Floyd's murder, it obviously was a huge topic of conversation in a lot of boardrooms. And a lot of the brands that were getting the most heat or having to really reevaluate their stances were the fashion companies. And that opened the door for them to really revisit and authentically look deep. It wasn't just a superficial conversation. So a lot of that has led to conversations and interactions with me. And in the wellness space, as the wellness industry continues to grow and develop, I think that they know that inherently wellness is about being the best version of yourself, being able to live in the world where you feel at peace and respected and valued. And that's really the end goal and end game of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's the three sectors I focus on. But I also, kind of a sub niche I do is I like to work with companies that are at a particular inflection point. So they're about to launch, they're about to raise funds, or they're about to exit. And so these are particular startups or, growing companies. As of late, some of the DTC darlings, if you will, or those companies that are really making headlines that every move they make matters, tend to be in the fashion, beauty, and wellness space as well. So that has all converged into that being my primary focus for clientele.
Right, right, Muna. Now, I wanted to understand now, with such an expert like you, how can brands and businesses they can get started with DEI? A lot of companies are there in India. There is a certain focus on CSR. Inherently, a lot of businesses, or especially small businesses, they keep on doing a lot of work on the ground. But if specifically they want to focus on DEI, how do they get started? People, there are many genuine companies, small companies, businesses who want to actually do it, but
Yeah.
don't know how to start, where to start. So that's where an
Yeah.
expert like you can help. How to start?
So the first few steps you should take, number one, is commitment to being honest with yourself, most importantly. The most difficult conversations to have or difficult situations to affect change is when you're not honest about where you are or where you want to go. And that's creating a no judgment zone, giving yourself grace, allowing the people who are in the room, whether it's, your co-founders or your executives or even just family and friends that you're bouncing ideas off of, that you all have a commitment to being honest and being judgment free. That's number one. And then number two is defining what diversity, equity, and inclusion is for you. That's an important step that gets missed so often. And it leaves people, grasping at straws or trying to figure out where they're going the entire way. So when we say diversity, what does diversity mean for you? I work with some companies that from the outside or from other people, they would consider them very diverse. They have people of different races and ethnicities all throughout their company. But when they say diversity, they may say, well, we actually are all women or we're all men. So we want to bring more people in that are from different gender and sexuality backgrounds, right? Or, well, we're a company, I actually worked with a company that was incredibly diverse racially and ethnically, gender, sexual orientation, everything, but they marketed themselves as an international company, an international team, that whenever you worked with them, you could work with people from all over the world. And then when I did my analysis, 85% of their team was based in the US. That's an important thing to realize when you're defining diversity. For them, diversity needs to mean a truly global team. And how are we hiring for people who aren't just in LA and New York and Chicago? So when you define diversity for yourself, or what metrics or specifically what identity groups you really feel like you need to make a difference in, that's step one, or step two. And a kind of a rule of thumb that I use is that diversity is the opposite of homogeny. So just the existence of difference, people who aren't like the people that are already in your organization. So that's a good place to start. And then the third factor is that understanding that this will not happen overnight. When a lot of the feelings of failure or the ability to not move forward is because they feel like they have to make a change now. So if you think about your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy as a 5-year plan by default, it makes it easier to get started, because that means if in 5 years I want to double the number of people I have who are from outside of the US, then you can set your 1-year goal as a 5% increase, your 2-year goal as a 15% increase, and a 3-year goal as a 50% increase. And then over time, you'll reach those numbers. So by creating a plan and then setting up metrics to meet that, essentially checkpoints, then that will actually have the strategy that you do to support that fall into place. Because the strategy that comes from that is, okay, if you want to get 5% increase this year, what do you need to do get that 5%? That's a lot easier than saying, what do I need to do to get to the doubling it, which actually you don't need to really focus on until you're 3, 4, or 5.
Right. Does implementing DEI in organizations, does it cost money, or is it about including more people so it can cost money only in that manners and not in any other manner? What's your understanding of this?
DEI, like every other part of a business, is an investment. And it's an investment in time, it's an investment in energy, and oftentimes it's an investment financially. And I think that the difficult thing of people accepting that is because they don't necessarily know how to measure ROI. Because we invest, when we sign a lease to have an office or a retail space, that's an investment. Whenever we hire folks or expand our team, that's an investment. So companies are in the business of spending money to make money. They just don't quite see how spending that money makes them money in the future. So I 100%, 1000% don't want to ever have anyone misinterpret that DEI is something that takes no money, no effort, no time.
Okay.
But I really challenge people to really think about what you can gain from this. If nothing else, especially for small businesses, especially for startups, this is where the future is headed. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be next month, it may not be next year, but if you want longevity in your business, you need to be thinking about this and thinking about it now. So if nothing else, you're allowing yourself the sustainability to keep your business going. And a number of businesses that were shut down or CEOs that were ousted in 2020, if they would have had these conversations in 2019 or 2018 or earlier, that wouldn't have been the situation they've been in. So the success of their business was dependent on having these conversations. So the ROI is there. It can be calculated on so many different metrics. It attracts more talent. It prolongs your customers' lifetime value because they stick with you and believe in you and share your values. It makes people, it retains talent, they stay longer. It makes you a great partner to work with for B2B or supply chain businesses. There's so many benefits that financially you gain from for that upfront. For the upfront investment. So I absolutely, there's no question about it that it's a worthy investment for a lot of businesses and brands to make.
Right. A lot of surveys, Muna, say that it can increase, DI can increase sales revenue, customer base, and ultimately increase profits. But why is that very less number of companies have actually, focused on DEI. That number is growing, but why haven't they got it that DI is the way to the future? Is it that they understand all other numbers but not the DI numbers, how it is not actually a cost but an investment, and equity is not just only for the other side but also it increases and builds a better equity for you in the long run. Why is it that reluctance for companies, or is it that inherently they don't want to do it, or they don't simply understand it because it's uh, too much of work to do?
I would say all of the above. I think that there's some companies that fall into all of those categories, but there's also, right, when we talk about there's many companies in the world. So they each have their own kind of area as to why they aren't pursuing DEI in earnest. I think oftentimes it's a lack of knowledge and understanding. They don't understand what DEI is. They don't understand that it's an effective, important tool for growth, and they don't necessarily understand how it fits into their business. So that's it. They just don't know. They don't know where to start. They don't know what to do. They don't know where to go, which is oftentimes where clients come to me. They don't know, so they need to outsource or find an expert who can advise them or do it on their behalf. So that's the first one. The second, as you had mentioned, there are people who don't actually believe in its value, right? Like this, as if good people exist, bad people exist, right? So in the same way that there are people who are trying and failing at DEI, there are some people that don't want DEI to exist, who don't believe that companies need to be more diverse, do not believe that inclusion is an important value to have, and don't believe that equity is an essential part of growth. They don't believe that. And I know that there's a lot of conversation and data about like the survivability of those companies, but it's the truth, right? That they exist, and maybe they just operate in certain sectors, or maybe a little bit more low key about sharing that stance, but they exist, and that I think is an important acknowledgement that that it's not always just about giving them the resources. And then there's also the category of people who think that they're doing a lot but actually aren't. And that's actually, I think that's something that continues to happen now in the past couple of years, is that people are making commitments or are implementing DEI strategies that just aren't working. And that can create a level of shame and guilt that keeps people from moving forward. DEI can be an incredibly vulnerable and difficult and complex thing. It doesn't have to be, but it often is for people, especially with the world and society's relationship with race and difference and bias and discrimination. So oftentimes if someone feels vulnerable or scared to make a move and then does their best to make a good DEI move and it fails, the shame and guilt will keep them from maybe even acknowledging it, from trying again, from getting help, because they're embarrassed. And that group of people is also kind of what comes into the clientele that I work with. But it's, I think, why it's a long game, right? That there's plenty of times in business that people fail and try again. Like failure is not a foreign concept in business. It just sometimes feels deeper. It cuts deeper, feels more difficult, has more shame around it in DEI than some of the other areas of business.
Right. Muna, you also talk about, mental health, and it plays a big role in DEI. What exactly do you mean? Where do these two things come together?
Mental health has always been important. It's become a huge conversation since the pandemic essentially kept people in their homes for so long, and people's relationship to work, to society, to consumerism has shifted. So I think it's an important thing to know and to bake into this DEI conversation. If we look at the history of DEI, if you will, I would say that some of the first iterations of what I consider modern 21st century DEI was women in the workplace, was gender diversities. How do we get women in positions of power? How do we get them in the workforce? How do we get them respected? The second phase, if you will, was racial and ethnic diversity. How do we get people of color? How do we get people who are non-white, people who look different, speak different, come from different backgrounds, in positions of power and valued and respected? And I think the third phase, or something that's kind of adding nuance to that is across the board, how do we get people who are overworked, underappreciated, and oftentimes underpaid? How do we get them to be valued and respected and feel good in the workplace, right? Like the conversation of burnout has been a big one because it impacts the success of your business in the long run. You can have a great employee for a year, for 6 months, but if they can't perform on the back end because they're overworked, it creates a business expense that could have been turned into a business growth opportunity if those controls were put in place before, or that baseline of developing a really mentally healthy and mentally well environment was done ahead of time. So I think that's a kind of a newer area, and that's a conversation I'm introducing to my clients versus them seeking it out. But I do think it's going to continue to be a bigger conversation, especially as, for lack of a better phrase or better way to say, is that people are kind of getting fed up with the way the workplace has been and how businesses have operated over the past several decades. So I think it's time to reevaluate that and see what the future looks like.
Right, what the future looks like. So my last question is to understand from you, Muna, is that going forward, do you think DEI will be something that people will or companies will have a time to think whether to implement, or is it that they will be left with no choice but to implement it because people or workers will prefer to be in companies which have this particular concept? What is your understanding of now and the future?
My understanding, it depends on the time frame in which you say future. I think that 30 years from now, it'll become a default. Just as much as, and I think about the things that we consider standard now that were once considered luxuries, whether it's 100 years ago in terms of labor laws in the US, the idea of a 5-day work week or 40-hour work week was not standard. Paid sick leave was not standard. Those things seem so standard, but they were revolutionary back then. So I think that given time and a long time horizon, these things will become very standard. But in the short term or the shorter term, maybe in a few years, 5-10 years, I think it's going to be a litmus test that the brands that are focusing on DEI will become the most successful, will be the household names, will gain the respect of younger consumers, and that will lead to the wider spread adoption. But I think for now, for the next couple of years, it'll just simply be how consumers make their buying decisions, less so of a standard part of the internal conversations happening at businesses and boardrooms.
Right. So for those companies and brands who don't want to wait for 30 years to implement it, but now, how do they connect with you and how do they do that?
You can connect with me on LinkedIn and on my website, mkedi.com, so mkedi.com. And I really love having open, honest, vulnerable conversations about where people are and where they want to go. I believe in a 1,000% judgment-free zone, and I believe that change happens in steps. So I'm more than happy and excited to have conversations with people who have never done anything in DEI, who may just now be starting to think about DEI, but know that they have values they want to maintain and they have specific passions that they want to integrate into their business and be profit drivers for them. DEI should be a profit driving, exciting growth opportunity for any business.
Wonderful. On this note, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much for joining in.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.